Hey everybody, it's Candy, aka Brown Eyed Girl 69. How y'all doing? Well, let's see. Today is now July 26th, approximately 12:25 in the morning. Just got home about 10:30. Came in, did a couple little chores, took out the trash. Uh, Sorted out my things that I needed to sort out, and took a shower. Sat here, watched a couple of videos, caught up on a little bit of my social media. I watched a documentary uh, about this town in Missouri in 1966. And these were all like 16-year-old kids. And it was a documentary. I can't remember exactly who did the documentary, but the channel that posted about it, his name's David Hoffman. The majority of these kids in this town in Missouri, which I don't think was too far from St. Louis, um, they came across as spoiled. And they were like an early part of baby boomers because they would have been born in 1950, right? So then that got me to thinking, okay, well, what generation would these kids' parents come from? And majority of those kids' parents probably came from what they call the Great Generation. There was also another couple terms known for the Great Generation, but that was my grandparents' generation. My grandparents was born in 1905. My parents was born in 1933. They were part of what they called the silent generation. And then you had the baby boomers, and then the Gen Xers, and then the millennials, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So it got me to thinking because my mom's silent generation and her parents were the Great Generation, but they were early part of Great Generation, like 1905, whereas the Great Generation last ended in 1927. So these kids that were born in 1950, if their parents had been born in 1927, their parents would have been 23 when they had their kids. And then in 1966, they would have been like 39. So on the verge of 40. So I started looking into the different generations to see what that generation was based off of, basically. Like, okay, the Great Generation, my grandparents' generation, they basically went through World War One and the Great Depression. But when they were children, it was World War One. The Federal Reserve didn't become a thing until I think it was 1913. Is when the Federal Reserve went into play, and then the New Deal, which included Social Security numbers being issued. That was in the 30s, mid 30s, 35, 36, somewhere around there. So my grandparents being born in 1905, they were like 8 years old when the Federal Reserve came into play. So they were still young enough to be basically indoctrinated into this new system. that involved money, um, different than what had been previously in the system. My grandparents were farmers. My grandpa, he was in the oil field business um, early on in his life. And then he bought a farm and became a dairy farmer. Um, so my grandparents, basically, when my mom was growing up, she told me that they made a lot of everything. Like they made their own butter. Uh, they baked. Grandma baked their own bread. Uh, there was a slaughterhouse in town, so if they needed to, uh, kill off a calf or something like that, so they'd have meat. They had that ability as well. Um, they had a fruit and vegetable garden. Um, so they had things to sustain them during the hard times, during the Depression. But that frugalness and that saving for a rainy day kind of attitude came from my grandparents. And then they kind of pushed that off onto their children. And the silent generation, they were born during a time between World War One and World War Two. During World War Two, before the Great Depression and World War Two. My mom and dad was born in 1933. Silent Generation started, I think, at 28 and ran until 1945, the end of World War Two. And the children born during that time frame basically learned how to grow up frugal as well as compliance. And they were also the silent generation. I just thought of this for something I read. They're also known as the radio babies. The reason why I say that is because when my mother was a child, they didn't have TV. TV wasn't invented yet. And if there was TVs, only the rich owned them, and they weren't offered to the public yet. I don't think the TVs came around until the mid 40s, like probably right around wartime, the end of the war, 1945, I think. Yeah, I think mom said she was 12 when TV first was offered to the public. But my grandparents didn't get a TV until probably the early 50s. Um, so my mom was a radio baby. Basically, they listened to like the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday nights. Saturday nights was the night they had their bath. They didn't have running water or in the house. They had an outhouse. They didn't have running water in the house. I don't think. No, they didn't. And electricity, yes, I think they did have electricity. But I don't know how good of it was. I don't know how good it was. Anyway, so on Saturday nights they'd all get their baths and sit around and listen to the radio, to the Grand Ole Opry, and then on Sundays they'd go to church. My mother grew up basically being frugal. She grew up being learning responsibility. You work hard. And basically, it's that generation that I call lifers. Um, Boomers are lifers too. There's lifers in every generation, I guess. It just depends on how you were raised. And when I call a lifer is somebody that basically they go to school, they get good grades, um, or not. They most of the time go to college to try to better their education so they can get a better job. They find that one job and stay at that one job 30, 40 years. That's a lifer. My mother was one of those types of people. She stayed at a job long term. Uh, I think it was in 19. Let's see, when did that be? 1958, I think. Yeah, 1958 to 1974. She was a telephone operator. She used to wear a little headset on her head and connect people, call them long distance and all that. Landlines. That was the technology back then, you know. So she was a telephone operator from 1958 to 1974, 16 years. Then my dad made her quit because he didn't want his child to be a latchkey child. But by the time I was in junior high, I guess, and we'd moved away from here to another town that was a little bit more prosperous, I suppose, with the appearance of prosperity, which kind of, I think, threw me into talking about this because watching that documentary, I kind of felt like I was watching a documentary on a portion of the town that I grew up in as a teenager. You know, conservatism. You basically do what the government tells you to do. Go to school, get good grades, go to college. You know, make something of your life. Money, buy a nice house, have nice cars. Materialism. Those things never interested me. I didn't ever want to be stuck in some town with people I went to high school with. I wanted to get out and see the world, you know. So watching that documentary, you know, did make me think a lot about the different generations. And my mom's still alive; she's 93, and I guess it's kind of made me go back through in my mind um, my life, the different decades, I guess, of my life, and why I was raised the way I was raised. And I had to study those two different generations, the great generation and the silent generation, to understand why I was raised the way I was raised. And the reason why I say I had to study both generations is because I had to see how my parents was raised by their parents. And knowing what I know about my grandparents and what I researched about their generation, and then knowing what I know about my parents, it all falls into line now. I understand why my mom and dad were the way they were. And it wasn't anything of their own doing per se. You know, it's just the way the cookie crumbled, and that's just the generation that they were brought up in. Whereas, like my generation, I'm Gen X. Um, so my generation, basically, we were born to those boomers. You know, that were born in like me. I was born to a boomer that was born in 1952. Um, Most kids my age, their parents were early boomers, early to mid type boomers. Whereas, like my birth mother, she was a boomer, but my adoptive parents was silent generation. But I'm Gen X, and basically, even though most Gen X kids were raised by boomer parents, um, maybe some in the late silent generation, whatever. My parents was 36 years old when I came along. Um, so I was raised a little differently than, say, some of my friends whose parents weren't born, say, until 45 to 1950, you know? A little bit of an age gap there, By then, my parents were in their teen years when my friends' parents were just being born. So, taking that into consideration, most Gen Xers were raised by boomers. And boomers were conservative, they were lifers, and I think there were some boomers, though, that rebelled against the system. And I think those were deemed hippies. And they were the hippies, but what was I going to say? Like, my generation, my parents didn't care at all, you know. Children were to be seen and not heard. That was my parents' generation's motto. Children are to be seen and not heard. Could have been a little bit of the boomer motto too. But yeah, summertime, I was never home. Summertime, uh, if my mom was working or something, I had a babysitter. When I got a little older, when I was like 7, 8, I think my mom had a part-time job at the grain stamp store here in town, and I had a summertime babysitter, a couple of teenage girls, and so we never, you know, we were always out doing something. They were trying to give that 7, 8-year-old girl as much experience as they could, I guess, without getting me into too much trouble. Because my babysitters, they were decent kids, decent girls. They weren't. They didn't smoke cigarettes. They didn't do drugs. Go out drinking. They didn't have a lot of boyfriends. They each had a boyfriend whom they're still married to this day. Um, but yeah, I feel like Gen X just had a lot more freedom. We didn't have to come home until the streetlights came on. Um, we didn't have technology to keep track of us. Pictures were something taken for a memory or a special occasion. Once these cell phones came out and pictures became a thing, it's like nobody holds anything special anymore because it all has to be some kind of a moment, to create for content or whatever. It's ridiculous. Anyways, that's all I really wanted to talk about, was just the different generations and how, I kind of got triggered by watching that documentary, which I will probably link the documentary in the description below so y'all can watch it. It's only like, I think 18 minutes long. And I love David Hoffman. Um, he's an awesome filmmaker and a man before his time, really, as far as him being a young man and deciding to document things back, like I said, when these types of devices weren't in everybody's hands. Everybody didn't have a recording device or the ability to make documentaries or whatever, So that was a gift that he was given, and um, I'm very grateful for the man. He's brought a lot of life into a lot of the past generations. Give you an insight onto what life was back in those days from some of the documentaries and stuff that he's done and interviews and things of that nature. Anyways, peace, love, hugs, and nugs. It's about 12:45. I got to be at work in about 12 hours. So if I want to get a full 8 hours of sleep, that means I'd have to go to bed right now, get up about 8:45, and be walking out of here at 12:45. My main goal is probably to get up about 9 a.m. in the morning. So yeah, I'll probably be heading to bed here in the next hour or so. Peace, love, hugs, nugs. And until the next time, I'm out.